So, looking at the poem 712, because I could not stop for death. A couple of critical quotes here to help you access this poem initially. One of them by Helen Venlo, who wrote a brilliant book of single poem commentaries on Emily Dickinson. And she explains in her commentary on this poem that the purpose of it is to describe the moment when the concept of personal immortality was shocked into disappearing from the speaker's consciousness. So the notion of immortality in a spiritual domain is destroyed in some way by some developing realization about the real nature of mortality. The poem was called by the first publishers The Chariot, because they wanted to allude to the chariot sent from heaven to translate Elijah, who didn't die, to eternity. So they completely and willfully attempted to misrepresent the meaning of this poem. And it couldn't really be further from Dickinson's actual message in this poem, which is about understanding the reality of physical mortality rather than emphasizing some form of saving grace in some way. Now, the opening couplet, because I could not stop for death, he kindly stopped for me, shows us first of all the youthful failure to grasp the significance of mortality. I couldn't stop for death. I wasn't aware of it and had no intention of understanding it. So it gives us a sense of innocent naivety regarding mortality. But he kindly stopped for me. So this death here is personified as an allegorical embodiment of the concept itself as an individual. He kindly stopped for me. Which obviously gives death this kind of odd geniality. So there's a jarring contrast here between the geniality of the meaning of the words, the semantics, and the grim content of the realization that this stands for, that death kindly stops to remind me about the absolute quality of physical mortality. There's a real tension between the language and the content that he would be reminding the speaker about here. The carriage held but just ourselves and immortality. So there's this narrative in this poem of death turning up in a horse-drawn carriage, offering the speaker a kind of a ride, a journey towards the realization. So the vehicle, this carriage, is the vehicle for the metaphorical journey of realization that you see in the poem. And the carriage held but just ourselves here, the assonantal echo of the short E sound, gives us a harmonic sort of warm sense of comfortable enclosure within this carriage. It holds just ourselves and the concept of immortality, that they were all there in this cozy little triad, having a lovely time. But obviously this warmth and geniality is something that the poem goes on to undermine. So it just held ourselves and immortality. So it's not invited by the deathly coachmaster, but part of the baggage of cultural norms. You know, the deathly coachmaster has not said, hey, immortality, you get in here as well. It's just part of the expectations. Obviously, someone arrives with some sense of immortality and believes in it in some way. It's just an accepted part of life. But the speaker here is in physical proximity to the allegorical figure, which shows us that it's still a part of her personal beliefs, that she sat near immortality. And the full rhyme with me creates this close sense of bonding between the speaker and the concept of immortality. We slowly drove, he knew no haste, and I had put away. I and he meld into we here, that I, the speaker, and he, death, becomes a we as the significance of the concept begins to strike the speaker. There's a movement of internalizing death in some way. He knew no haste. So there's this sort of personification of death, this driving this carriage without rushing, suggesting a sense of supreme confidence in eliciting the epiphany of realization that he is going to attempt to create. And I had put away my labour and my leisure too for his civility. There's a signal of focus and fascination about the speaker here, and perhaps of morbid, youthful morbid curiosity about what death is going to bring with him in this realization. I'd put away my labour and my leisure shows us that the extent of the speaker's interest. I'd put away everything I was working on and the things I was doing for fun. And the alliteration between these words, I think, gives us a clear sense of their contrasts of work and pleasure, but emphasizes the extent of the speaker's interest and shows us that it becomes an obsession. There's a sense here of, I think, of a poetic disclosure of themes like Dickinson's reclusive lifestyle in this, of putting away her labour and leisure for his civility, of putting away her work and her pleasurable activities, which seem to be one and the same thing in this, for the civility of death. This is obviously highly euphemistic in this extended personification of death, and indirectly emphasizes its sinister intent, that the civility that death is displaying is just about precipitating an awareness of mortality. In the carriage ride, we passed the school where children strove at recess in the ring. So here, if you think about each of these places that Dickinson's speaker moves past in the carriage with death, they become spatial equivalents for the phases of life, and at each place there is a different lesson. So we start with childhood passing a school where children strove. There's a jarring kind of subversion of playful innocence in this verb choice of past tense of striving. There's this verb here suggests innocent play as some kind of determined effort. If you strive after something, you strive at recess. There's a suggestion here that you're trying really hard to do something, perhaps to confront the advance of time or to avoid the grasping of mortality. You know, it's a really horrifying vision of childhood innocence here as a conscious effort to avoid this truth that death is taking the speaker towards. At recess in the ring, there's a sense through this alliteration of this R sound, of enclosure, of perhaps comfortable enclosure within the paradigm of innocence that children experience within these innocent perceptions. And it mirrors this sense of the carriage being enclosed and tightly bound and almost kind of claustrophobic. So there's a sort of reversal there of that sense of enclosure to a comfortable childhood that goes on to be destroyed. We passed the fields of gazing grain, we passed the setting sun. Now, this anaphora, this repetition of the phrase we passed, obviously emphasizes the advance of time through this journey, which obviously suggests the movement towards mortality. And these fields of gazing grain, passing fields of grain that are personified as if they are staring hard at their surroundings, as if they're aware of their own momentary, imminent reaping, that they're going to be hacked down, attempting to sort of subsume everything unto themselves, looking while they still can. Or there's a way that you could read this as a kind of casual naivety. They're just aimlessly gazing and have no awareness of this approaching sense of death and mortality. And we pass the setting sun here. Obviously, this is a very typical symbol of the approaching death, of life ending. And the fact that this isn't reflected on shows us that it casts the speaker as someone who is naive, because they fail to extrapolate the symbolic significance of these things. You know, we've got a speaker who doesn't get that this setting sun in some way signifies mortality. So we have this sense of almost dramatic irony on the part of the speaker that we as the reader are picking up on through reading the poem. We can see the setting sun. It's a very obvious symbol of the ending of something. And so both of these gazing grain, these fields of gazing grain, and the setting sun function as the symbols of the phases of life and of the final move into darkness. Or rather, he passed us. The dews drew quivering and chill. So, there's a suggestion here of reversal. He passed us. The subject and object of this sentence is reversed. And therefore, there's an apprehension about passing into darkness and attempting to keep the light of the sun ahead in her mind. So we've got this suggestion here of the setting sun. We passed the setting sun, or rather he passed us, as if the sun itself is moving beyond them. And in her mind, it appears that she's trying to keep that light of the sun ahead of her, and shows some form of preference for the sun being ahead rather than setting past them. So there's, I think, an effort to kind of cling on to some form of optimism and redemption in that phrase. But then that fails. The dews drew quivering and chill. So there's no advance warning of this from the driver. There's no dashes here. There's this sudden appearance of the coldness and of its suggestion of encroaching mortality. So here, the landscape mirrors the speaker's internal condition. So we have an example here of pathetic fallacy, where the dews drawing, quivering and chill seems to mirror the internal state of the speaker. And that quivering obviously connotes a sense of encroaching fear, and the coldness connects to mortality. Now this is a really interesting construction here. For only gossamer my gown, my tippet only tulle. She's describing the clothing that she's wearing. A tippet and a gown are different parts of the clothing around her torso. And they're both made from fragile materials, gossamer and tulle. Both of these materials are extremely fragile, gauze-like materials. So we have this sense here of the fragile materials being on the outside of this phrase here, gossamer, gown, tippet, tulle. If you imagine material and item and material, you have what's called a chiasmus, a reversal of the logic of that phrase across this particular sentence. So you have A, B, B, A, material, item, item, material. So you have the material and item reversed in the second part of the sentence, which is the nature of a chiasmus. But what you then have is the delicate materials on the outside of this construction. And so objects are enclosed grammatically in this phrase by their vulnerable materiality, which is ever so much like the situation that the speaker finds themselves in, protected by vulnerable awareness or vulnerable naivety that is going to be destroyed by this approaching sense of mortality that the chariot is driving her towards. Here you can see these materials of gown or a cassock made and a tippet made from tulle or gossamer. So these materials are the ones that we're talking about. And it's no coincidence that these are religious robes that she's describing wearing that are being gradually destroyed. We paused before a house that seemed a swelling of the ground. So here, this is the end of this naivety, because there's a pause. So they're no longer innocently passing things, passing the fields of gazing grain and not reflecting on them. The speaker is taking full conscious interest in the things that are surrounding her because there is a growing awareness. A house that seemed a swelling of the ground. There's a confused perception of her own grave here, I think. And the personification here is the ground swelling. The ground is what is alive here. Death itself comes alive in this personification. And it's subsuming this house, which I think also suggests the sort of swelling nature of her realization of it gradually developing. And there's also a connotation of wounding here, of wounding, that sense of innocence and naivety, of swelling coming from some form of impact or wounding. And here the visual description of a sinking tomb creates that sense of death absorbing all. The roof was scarcely visible and the cornice was in the ground. So death simply reveals the tomb here without digesting the significance. But the roof is scarcely visible. The roof of this tomb is visible because it's being absorbed by the swelling ground, like her innocence itself. And the cornice here, this decorative component of the roof, is in the ground. So there's something paradoxical physically about this, that you would have the roof of a building in the ground, which I think mirrors the grim realization about the nature of mortality. And this repetition of the ground gives it this grim, immovable quality. That's what we're fixating on, is this expansion of the ground, which contains obviously bodies and death. Since then, it is centuries. So we then have this sense of time having passed vastly from this position that the speaker is in. And we wonder then, well, where is this spoken from? Is this spoken in some way from beyond the grave? And yet it feels shorter than the day. So the day of realization feels longer than this expansion of eternity. I first surmised the horses' heads were towards eternity. So I first surmised. A surmise is based on inadequate evidence. So I first had this cagey realization that the horses' heads, the direction of the chariot, is metaphorically represented through this alliterative image, were pointed towards eternity. They were pointed towards the eternal void, and that eternity would oust immortality in this grim realization that this journey leads us towards.